Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Peter Langen. I'm a correspondent for Asia Times based out of Hong Kong, and I'll be your MC for today. Just wanted to, just mainly one housekeeping item. If everyone could remember to do what I'm doing right now and mute your phones or turn them off just to prevent any musical interludes in our speech today. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Ms. Nomi Prins, and the topic, of course, today, which is one that's been much discussed all around the world. How will a Donald Trump America affect the world? Of course, in our particular case, how will it affect Japan and global markets? And particularly as Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister, is in Washington meeting with Mr. Trump today. So news reports tell us. I might just add, Ms. Prins just landed in Japan and is actually suffering from quite a bad cold. So she lost her voice yesterday. Hopefully it has returned today, but it's still a little how should we say, shaky. Shaky's the word, if you could be aware of that. Can I also just point to a couple of books we have here? These are previous books that Ms. Prins authored. All the President's Bankers is available, of course, in English. And the two other books you can see there are actually the Japanese translation of those works, which actually have just been published this week. Just to let you know if you wish to follow up on further reading. But anyway, enough from me. I'd just like to ask you again to please provide a welcome for our speaker today, Ms. Nomi Prins. Thank you.
It grows. Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much, Peter, for being the MC for organizing this event here. It's really quite an honor as a journalist to be able to be here at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Japan. Before I start with the presentation part of what I'll say, and I am also thankful that my voice has come back, because yesterday I was talking at the Tokyo Stock Exchange and it was touch and go. And on that, I also just wanted to thank my friend here, Adrian Rawls, who is also representing Devere Group, which is a financial advisory group here, but also a very dear friend and his colleague Andy Lepper there for just organizing my entire life here for this week in Tokyo. I arrived last Friday, and there's been a lot of activity and a lot of events, and it's really nice in general when the world comes together anywhere. I mean, that's what we do as journalists, right? We look at things, we bring the world together, and it's nice to have people do that and make things happen and make things possible. And also just my publisher here, who is here, who I just met about 10 minutes ago, half an hour ago, Yun Mimura, who is part of Hayakawa Publishing, who managed to somehow get this book together so that when I actually landed in Narita on Friday afternoon, I had no idea that the Japanese version would even be here when I was here. So it's just like I opened up my iPhone, and that was one of the first emails I got. And then my agent here, Hamish, who works with everyone, had an email to me saying that happened, and it was like, oh, this is cool. This is fortuitous. Anyway, so I just wanted to talk about the sort of confluence of events that kind of are fortunate to be happening for me, and just as I address you here today. As Peter mentioned, one of the biggest topics, and as you know right now, is that we just elected a new president in the United States, Donald Trump, who will be starting his inauguration on January 20th, 2017, and who is already picking his cabinet and also already changing some of what he's going to be doing with respect to what he said he was going to be doing in the selection of that cabinet, and in general in some of the things that he has said to the press and through his Twitter feed since he has been elected, which I will also talk about, and also in the context of what's happening so politically, financially, from a journalistic perspective throughout the world. There's been a real set of changes going on. One of the reasons I think Trump became voted president in the United States was because there was a real sense of sort of economic instability amongst the population, or certainly amongst the population that voted for him. There were also people that voted for him for some of the views he's had about certain types of people, and from that perspective. But from an economic perspective, what has been discussed sort of both in the press and from the White House and in general has been that the situation, the conditions in the United States from an economic perspective are better than they might feel to the average American. And during the election period, that was really a big theme. Before Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee, Bernie Sanders had a lot of support from a particular part of the United States, and for similar reasons, that there was a lot of economic instability. There was a lot of concern about how sort of the powers that be were operating in terms of the banking system, in terms of everybody's day-to-day situation, in terms of healthcare, in terms of costs, in terms of general futures. And Trump sort of took to an extent, a side of that as well, that resonated with Americans who were concerned. One of the things that he talked about then in terms of what he would do is, though, isolating certain peoples and certain trade agreements and sort of the United States as a country to sort of, as he said, make America great again, which resonated, but at the same time, from a policy perspective, the United States as an isolationist, completely going back to the days of really the 1920s, which was the last time, and I talk about that in all the President's Bankers, but the last time the U.S. had a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Congress, Republican Senate, and was isolationist was in the 1920s. And something that happened in the 1920s was a financial crisis, and that's kind of what ties into what we're seeing now. In 1929, there was a big crash in the United States from a market perspective. It resonated throughout the world. It resulted in a Great Depression, so it resulted in a lot of economic depression, and it came out of, to an extent, the idea of an isolationist policy and a deregulation policy in the financial system, in the banking community. So two things came together. Where we're at today, even before Trump having come in as the president-elect for the United States, is we're still in the wake of a financial crisis. There's been extents to which it has looked like it has been fixed on the outside. Markets are at all-time highs or near all-time highs throughout the world from a stock perspective. Certain real estate has come back from where it was during the financial crisis, but the realities of people on the ground isn't the same. And that was one of the things that fed into our election. But also it's something that I talk about in terms of how the financial crisis was dealt with. In particular from the standpoint of central banks throughout the world, and a coordinated policy from the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank, the ECB in Europe, the Bank of Japan here, and to a sort of different kind of extent, the People's Bank of China in China, where since our financial crisis, the Fed really engineered an environment of cheap money, of 0% and negative % interest rates, where countries throughout the world have had to basically adjust the cost of money and had to bear the brunt of what that means for inflation or deflation, and have wanted to still look at economic growth as separate or as being catalyzed by that cheap money policy, and the two don't necessarily go together. Having zero interest rate money, as the Fed altered in 2008, hasn't necessarily made the U.S. economy stronger, as was evidenced by the election. So these things are kind of 8 years in the process, and by how people felt about their own personal economies. And it's also ongoing. So if we have a situation where there was an emergency policy, and it was called an emergency policy, that was put into place in 2008, well, we're now in 2016 going into 2017, and that policy has simply globalized, and it's still in place. And the things that it was expected or discussed, and that the press, that we as journalists picked up on in many cases would happen from the standpoint of growth and stability, haven't necessarily happened, and nor has the policy stopped. So one of the things, for example, that Trump talked about when he was running for election was how the Federal Reserve is politicized. It was one of his talking points. It wasn't something that was really discussed as much on the Hillary Clinton side, but he made the point that the Fed was doing what the White House wanted the Fed to do. The reality is the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to basically support the banking system, and so it resides in Washington. It kind of exists as a private entity, but its head is appointed by the president, confirmed by Congress. So it is very much a political entity, and in particular, in a situation where it's developing a monetary policy, cheap money, throughout the world, and promulgating that throughout the world, it has a political role that's not even domestic. It's not even just for the United States. It's not even just about the dollar. It's about how all of the other large countries that are allies of the United States in particular, or competitors, have really manifested their own policies. He said that, well, in the wake of him saying that the Fed was political, and now that he is able to start to put together his inner cabinet, he's not changing the head of the Fed, which also shows something about U.S. monetary policy. There's other people in Washington that are starting to resign. For example, the head of the Securities Exchange Commission, which has been involved in fining and settling with some of the private banking and other institutions that were at the core of the financial crisis. Mary Jo White resigned. It's not clear who will take her place. The press is talking about different people, as is the Trump inner administration. But the reality is whoever does take her place will probably be either from the industry, from the financial industry that it is supposed to be policing, or former chair people that have not necessarily been the best at regulating the financial system. So that's just one area where, from a regulation perspective, Trump will probably be the cause of more instability and more financial deregulation, and sort of not having the right cop on the beat as might otherwise be. When he ran also with respect to the banking system, he talked about reinstating something called Glass-Steagall, which was an act that was passed in the Great Depression in 1933 in the wake of the 1929 crash in the United States that caused crashes throughout the world. And the idea of it was something that both Bernie Sanders ran on and that Donald Trump ran on in a different way, which was to break up the big banks, to break up the large banking institutions in the United States, including JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, the banks that were basically the crux of the crisis. And Bernie Sanders ran on that and got a lot of public opinion and public votes and money donated from individuals and contributions during the campaign for that very stance. And when he basically was out of the race and Hillary Clinton became the official nominee for the Democratic ticket, the Republican National Convention and the Republican committee decided to adopt this idea of reinstating Glass-Steagall and breaking up the banks. I think part of that was because he was trying to get some of the voters that might not have voted for Hillary but would have voted for Bernie Sanders, who were very much wanting that to happen, Glass-Steagall to be reenacted and banks to be broken up. And that was one of the reasons the platform was put on. But he also said he wants to do a lot of deregulation and a lot of dialing back. One of the things that Trump talked about was for every regulation that might be added, he wants to take away 3. So if you do the math, that becomes deregulation, and that could be in the financial industry, that could be in the healthcare industry, that could be in different industries. So it's more likely that's going to happen. In addition, one of the people that Trump talked about as being the potential Treasury Secretary for the United States was Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO and chairman of JP Morgan Chase, which was one of the big beneficiaries of bailout, of a Federal Reserve subsidization of cheap money throughout the world, in particular throughout the United States. He said no to the idea of that position. So he was, sort of under the table, potentially offered to think about being the Treasury Secretary of the United States. And the thing that still happens in the United States is that it's much more powerful to be running a bank than to be running the Treasury Department. And so he said no. And that I was talking to Peter and the guys here at lunch. One of the other people that said no to that idea of being the Treasury Secretary, as opposed to running Chase, and today that's JP Morgan Chase, was David Rockefeller, for example, who was offered the position by President Richard Nixon on the Republican side, as well as President Jimmy Carter on the Democrat side in the 60s and 70s, and said no to both of those because it was just more powerful and influential to sort of stay on the outside of Washington and influence from the outside and run a bank. And sort of that, so history is repeating itself from the standpoint of what a president says during a campaign period and what actually happens when they're in office are two different things. That's not news to Trump. That's kind of what happens. But in respect to what caused, I think the evolution into Trump, the zero interest rate money or negative money that we have throughout the world, and the general instability that's causing fragmentation in the world, whether that's in the United States from people on the ground, whether that's in Europe, whether that's here, the general sort of individual instability that's been caused in the wake of the financial crisis, that perpetuated where we are now, that's perpetuated a change also, which I'll talk about next in the alignment of superpowers, and how the U.S. and the dollar has been very central to the world since World War II from that perspective and from the Federal Reserve perspective. But there's been a shift since the crisis, which I think will continue to shift even more so towards the East, towards China, towards potentially really good opportunities for Japan in this sort of realignment of the world in the wake of the Trump administration, which I think is also something that's going to be happening. So there's three pillars of things that led to Trump and led to where we are right now from the standpoint of the United States, our election, and sort of our global position, as well as what journalists should be looking at. And that was a financial crisis that happened that created a lot of instability throughout the world, and that continues to exist, even if our electorate and our senior officials and governments don't necessarily acknowledge that. Two was the movements of the central banks throughout the world in terms of increasing their own influence, not just in monetary policy, but in how economies actually work relative to each other, how much debt is incurred and in what currencies throughout the world, acting as a coordinator for different central banks, as well as a competitor between central banks trying to work on their own countries, but being sort of swirled up in an international type of agenda as well, and then how that manifests politically. That manifests, for example, in Europe as votes, as Brexit, as votes of people to sort of change the sort of circumstances of the alignment of their country. That manifested in terms of the kinds of people that voted for Trump in this election. And I think it will cause these three things that have basically created the foundation for where we are today is also what are causing where the future is realigning from the standpoint of what the U.S. role is, whether it maintains the kind of strength it's had, or whether other countries who have already been concerned in the wake of our crisis have taken a more leadership role in terms of political agendas, diplomatic agendas, currency, connections and trade agreements outside of the United States continues to grow and continues to shift towards Asia and towards the East. And I think all of that is connected to where we started 8 years ago and where we're going now. In terms of other things that Trump had talked about relative to sort of that geopolitical and national and international relationships, of course, he ran under a platform of being anti-trade agreements. One of the major trade agreements that he discussed was NAFTA. And one of the major groups of people he discussed is taking jobs away from Americans who were Mexicans, and that resonated with a lot of Americans and a lot of his voters. The reality is when he said he was going, as he did many times, build a wall with Mexico, just this week he said it's not going to be a wall, it's going to be a fence. Mexico's not going to pay for it. They're going to try to basically raise money in throughout the U.S. budget to pay for it. And what happens with any kind of infrastructure building that the U.S. might lead? Well, that incurs more debt issuance from the United States, and that requires more international countries to buy that debt. So that doesn't necessarily change the trajectory of where the U.S. has been since the financial crisis. It just changes what Trump had said to basically on the campaign trail with what he has said since he's been elected, and we're only like a week. From the election period, and it's the same thing with the TPP. I mean, one of the two things he said was that he was against the TPP, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which obviously Japan has been a big proponent of, and it was just signed in the lower house and is moving to the higher house, and Abe has been very much a proponent of, obviously, because that's very important to Japan and to alliances here in Asia. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump came out against that during the election period. Hillary Clinton ultimately came out against the TPP during the sort of latter part of the election period, because that was the mentality of the voters in the United States, and that's kind of what had to be said. I think Abe thought, as recently as right before she lost, that there was going to be an ability to renegotiate or to basically open up the positivity of the United States to the TPP under Hillary Clinton administration, and not least because as Secretary of State, she was a big proponent of that. But now that's kind of dead in the water. Obama had said that he's not going to try to push that in the lame duck in the last 2 months of this period before Trump comes into office. Also, Trump's not about to pursue it because he railed against it in the election, and it's not worth his political capital to particularly resurrect that issue. There's a lot of things he can spend his political capital on as he comes into office, and as he understands, as presidents have to do, that there's a lot of people that run the United States, that run Washington, that aren't the president, and they have a lot of power and a lot of sway as to what actually happens versus what's said in any campaign, and this goes back throughout our history. I do think that what Trump does and what he has done as a businessman will come into play in terms of what he retains in office and with respect to the different power players that exist in Washington and will come into Washington, which is he is a deal maker. That was sort of the main thing that he is coming into play. And the way he did deals as a deal maker was to sort of divide and conquer, to do individual deals rather than collective deals, so that every one of his deals, and there's a lot of information for them that we don't know, and we will probably never know from the standpoint of his tax returns and how things were set up, but of what he did file and what we can glean as journalists looking through his Federal Election Commission documents, and what will probably happen going forward is that the deals he made for Trump Organization tended to be very different per country, very different per area, and I think that's going to really dictate a lot of how he behaves. So if Abe's having a conversation with him right now, or I don't know what time it is in the U.S. right now, but Thursday, it's much more likely that he'll be able to extract a U.S.-Japan type of an arrangement rather than pushing to resurrect the TPP and having that go anywhere. But what that does mean is opportunity for him, opportunity for Japan, because in this period where Trump's not going to look at collective trade agreements and collective arrangements, he's going to continue in that respect to be deal by deal, or be isolationist from that perspective. It means that Japan can basically lead its own TPP. I mean, it can basically work out arrangements where the U.S. isn't in the current first version, and Japan takes a leadership role in the first version of the TPP is one thing that can happen. Japan's already discussing major trade arrangements separately with China and South Korea as a triplicate. It's already signed an agreement with India. The Prime Minister was here this week before Abe went off to the United States, and there's opportunity to do more with Russia, which has been opened as well, because in this period where the U.S. is under Trump sort of figuring itself out from a collective multi-regional perspective, and so is only focused on sort of countries at a time. And again, that is something that both Washington and Trump can agree upon in terms of their backgrounds for now. Japan can really take this role. I mean, it can lead a TPP again. It can lead a triple agreement with South Korea and China. It can have stronger arrangements with Russia. And Russia's doing the exact same thing by having had stronger relationships with China, by having the BRICS Bank in China be an emerging development bank relative to, and not as big as yet, but the IMF and the World Bank. These are all shifts that have already been occurring. And I think they accelerate under Trump, both logically for the countries involved, but also because there's a vacuum there while he's paying attention to other things and working as he does work from the standpoint of deals and his own MO. And I think, again, that's good for Japan. In terms of a military perspective, I mean, as well, you know, Trump has talked about reducing the footprint of the United States throughout the world from a military perspective, requiring countries to step up, for example, in NATO, and to pay more than they would have paid. And this was something that resonated again with voters who, most of them, if you asked them what NATO was, wouldn't be able to say what it was. But the resonation of the U.S. paying less outside of the United States and using more of its money inside of the United States was something that very much resonated with the people that voted for Trump. But I think, that said, in Washington, there are a lot of lobbyists in the defense industry right now who are quite happy with how things have turned out because of the standpoint of who Trump will ultimately have in his cabinet and how we actually will continue in the United States to build a military and to build the defense budget. One of the main things he didn't say he would cut the fat out of in Washington when he was talking about regulations in the budget was the defense budget. So from the standpoint of a military perspective, from the standpoint of lobbyists, who are like thousands of them right now in Washington, and literally like they were kind of dormant. Not that the United States doesn't already have a major military footprint, but there were a lot of actual physical individuals who really got excited afterwards because of the amount of money they would be making in bringing contracts into certain elements of the military and certain defense contractors because of a larger budget from the standpoint of defense. So that's something that will be an easy priority, something he can easily spend political capital on within Washington. So I think that will continue. So again, if we look at what the election represented from the standpoint of America, sort of anger, instability, a desire to be more domestically oriented in terms of the promises Trump made. And what will actually happen? What will actually happen is we'll still have a large military footprint. It will still grow. There'll still be lobbyists and contractors who will be making much more money out of a Trump administration. Not necessarily than they would have made out of a Clinton administration, but certainly they will do well as that agenda takes place. Opportunity for Japan to really get into its own greater leadership role if it chooses to do that as these things are being sorted out. More deregulation in the financial industry, which is kind of bad for the United States and countries in general, because it just means that banks that haven't really been altered or reformed since the financial crisis and are in fact bigger. Our big 6 U.S. banks are 40% larger in terms of assets than they were before the financial crisis, so have gone in completely the opposite direction. That will continue to happen, and deregulating that industry will just mean that all the cheap money that came in through the central bank monetary policy has just basically fueled another speculative crash at some point. It is just a question of time. And that's something I don't think he's paying attention to, because the people he's bringing into, or potentially could bring into, his cabinet don't necessarily believe that. And then again, from the trade perspective, there is that timing with respect to Japan's opportunities and in general opportunities in the East and in countries outside the U.S. To grow relative to their positions globally. So that's really kind of covering those three main areas: the financial crisis, its manifestation, central banks, our election, why Trump won, and what he's likely to do in his first 100 days / year, in kind of a very quick overview. But that's really what we're dealing with as journalists, is kind of trying to look at all of these different elements and figure out which ones at a given point in time are most important and are most leading a shift, and to sort of dig through the rhetoric of what's said in Washington, by our leadership, our governments, anywhere, and hold those individuals accountable to what's actually happening on the ground, and how all of the sort of ground interplay is shaking out and manifesting, and what that can cause in terms of people and in terms of movements and in terms of instability or stability going forward. So with that, I think my voice is about to go, but I did want to open it up to some questions, because I know you're all you're all either foreign correspondents, or I know there's a journalism class over there, which is awesome. That might have some questions and is actually doing a report on what I just said. So I look forward to seeing how that comes out, and just in general, what might be on your minds. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nomi, for that roundup. Certainly a lot to cover. Do you think we could remove this? So we will open the floor to questions. As usual, it will be journalists first. If you could give your name and your affiliation. And if there's time, we can open it up to the broader floor. I think this lady was first.
Elaine Kurtenbach, Associated Press. Thank you for your presentation. Of course, as you pointed out, Trump is good at making deals, or at least he thinks he is. Looking back, it's hard for us to know how this will play out, but looking back at past examples of businessmen, billionaire businessmen who became heads of state, what is the track record, and do you see his background in this area as being a plus or a minus, especially considering conflict of interest concerns that are really very prominent right now?
That's a really good set of questions, Elaine. One of the things, and the press really, we did try to get into discussing his conflicts of interest, and what was interesting was that because of sort of the polarization of the electorate, the conflicts didn't really resonate with people that supported him, or having them didn't resonate. I actually did a piece, I think it was called Madoff in the White House, and the idea was that his conflicts of interest could become ours, and also that ours, i.e. our nations as well as the world's, and they really were his business interests, but also his judicial problems in terms of legal settlements and ongoing lawsuits. He is one of the most litigious, not just presidents, he's definitely the most litigious president. He's one of the most litigious businessmen that have had a senior position or any sort of noteworthy position in the country. He has something like 3,500 different lawsuits that he has been involved in the past, and many of them have settled, but some of them are ongoing. One of them, for example, is a lawsuit he has with Trump University students. Trump University was a sort of private university that was currently in the limelight for having extracted lots of money from its people in a sort of fraudulent manner. It's being tried right now in a San Diego court, and the date for the trial was supposed to be in this period of him being a president-elect versus being a president. So one major conflict is, well, he doesn't want to have to deal with that. So he's basically suggested that it be pushed to a time at which he has more sort of bandwidth. The reality is you're not going to have more bandwidth as a president than he was a president-elect. So he's already starting to show, and that's just one example, of pushing his personal issues, his personal business conflicts onto basically the United States. Now, one thing he also gets to do is appoint district judges throughout the country. Obama appointed just under about 300 different district judges throughout the country. What that means is if he has a lawsuit that's being tried for any part of Trump organization throughout the United States, and that district judge is up for reappointment, he can appoint someone who technically could be very favorable to his business interests. That's what he can do as the president, he also gets to appoint the Department of Justice head, the Attorney General. That also comes into play in terms of a legal ability to use his power to supersede any type of lawsuit he might have, any type of conflict he might have. He also gets to appoint the head of the IRS, which is an Internal Revenue Service, which is our tax service. Now, he's the one businessman / president who hasn't shown his taxes, and he's not going to show his taxes. There's no reason to. He got elected without having to do it. It's not like he's going to change his mind, and appointing the head of the IRS is one way to assure that that's not going to happen. Appointing the head of the SEC is one way to ensure that any potential legal situations that might come up with people financing him in the United States, and if they might have problems, or if his financial interests might have problems, appointing the head of the SEC is one way to somewhat ensure that they're not going to be looked upon. So those conflicts, they all still exist. And there's also the idea of international conflicts. He said when he ran that Trump Organization, which is a global organization, was going to be run by his children, that he was not going to allow any of his time to be spent by running his international business. The reality is his children are like in Washington right now developing part of the transition team that will take over a lot of the senior cabinet positions in the United States. So they're not nowhere. They're not running the business. They're basically with the Trump campaign, pretty much lock, stock, and barrel the entire time. So that's another thing. The way the United States law works is that if you, for example, going back to another big businessman who was a senior position, Hank Paulson, who ran Goldman Sachs, and he became the Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. When he became the Treasury Secretary in 2006, under law, he was supposed to divest of his shares in Goldman Sachs. And he did. He converted them to Treasury bonds. He made a ton of money doing that, but he did what was legally required. The president and the vice president, because they are elected and not appointed, aren't covered by that same law. So he didn't have to divest of any of his business interests, and therefore nor will he divest of all of those. So that again remains a conflict. So you've got legal conflict, you've got financial conflict, you've got a time management conflict, and you've got the fact that he's basically in charge of appointing officials who will jurisdict over all of these contracts within the inner circle of Washington. That's a very dangerous position from the standpoint of a republic, of a democracy to really be in. We haven't had that situation. The closest thing we've had to a situation where someone in a senior position in Washington had issues that affected the population and that basically resigned in sort of wave of dispute was back in after the 20s was Treasury Secretary who basically was the Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon for 3 different administrations during the isolationist deregulatory period of the 1920s, for Calvin Coolidge, for Harding, and for Herbert Hoover. He also had issues with taxes. He had some issues with evading taxes and moving his money around the world at the time, which you had to do physically. Now you just do it electronically. And he had people in his family who were running his businesses in different places, and he came into the equivalent as a billionaire into the White House. He left in the Hoover administration because he was being investigated by Congress for those misdeeds. And so Hoover basically put him he moved him to be an ambassador in Europe, so he kind of moved him out of the administration while this was going on, and later he settled for some of these. But you have to go back in history to find some of these senior people that either had conflicts and divested of them, or had conflicts and that were sort of called up upon them, and none of them were president. So we're basically in a new territory from the standpoint of conflicts that can absolutely still exist, and that absolutely in his role he has the power to set aside, as well as we have the power to continue to point out.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
G'day, Seth Robson from Stars and Stripes. You mentioned, I think most people are aware that Trump has said that he wants more concessions out of our allies, people like Japan, in exchange for our troop presence in these countries. And I'm just wondering, How do you think that's going to play out in terms of the negotiations with the Japanese government or other governments? Does Trump have to get something more out of these allies in exchange for keeping our forces here? I mean, how far is he going to? Would he be willing to go? Would he actually be willing to withdraw troops if he wasn't able to get concessions? Is it important to the allies would they give concessions, or would they consider saying, no, we're already paying enough, take your troops away? How do you think that's going to play out?
Yeah, I don't see, and that goes back to who's the inner circle in Washington, and the fact that, he's coming in with opinions, and from the standpoint of trade deals, those opinions might be negotiated into relationships or not, because he's good at that, and that's where he can exert himself and differentiate himself. But I really think with respect to the military, we're talking about the United States, and the reality is that if there's an increase in a military budget, and there's an increase in contracting, and there's an increase in the desire of people to come back and run things in the United States from the standpoint of their own power over the military and over where the footprint of the United States is, it's unlikely they're going to retract troops. I mean, I think the troop retraction is up there with the we're going to build a wall, no, we're going to build a fence. I mean, it's so, even more so, because the wall fence thing was was really such a sort of vote-getting kind of a statement, whereas taking real troops out of real places where there have been alliances, since the last World War is something that doesn't really fly with respect to Washington. So my guess is that that's not going to necessarily happen. The other thing that's not going to happen, which is also part of U.S. philosophy, is from a capital perspective, from a capital trade border perspective, which is that the Japanese have open markets and been more open in terms of capital flows over the years, and I think he's going to continue to push that because, one, it's something that the U.S. on both parties have been pushing globally for decades. Also, it's something that the banking sector has continued to push, regardless of whether they were pushing a Republican president or a Democratic president in terms of opening markets. So I think those two things will continue. From the standpoint of the third piece, which is just general trade agreements, that will be where there will be some pushback, because that is where he can sort of come out and again, use that sort of individual deal basis, and not necessarily use political capital in continuing to make those statements or deflect something like a TPP and call it something else later. So I think he can negotiate on a separate trade agreement with Japan. That's probably what's going on with Abe. Now, that's probably where his perspective is, not deal with the larger one. I think the military presence is going to be pretty consistent, and I think deregulation in the financial community is going to push the tide towards further requirement for capital movement in and out of Japan and in and out of the region. I mean, I think China is one of the places where there's going to be pushback, but at the same time, there's been an opening of the markets more recently. Their bond market is very large and has very few foreign investments in it, and I think that's something that bankers in the United States and his senior bankers will want to push. It depends who becomes Treasury Secretary on that, but the two people that are in the running for Treasury Secretary, net of Jamie Dimon, is Steve Mnuchin, who is a former Goldman Sachs partner and is very much pro open capital borders, and a man named Wilbur Ross, who's a billionaire and also sort of an international capital movement kind of person. And so I think that will happen.
Yes, sir, at the back.
Sarah Conrad from TVS Television. I understood that Donald Trump being president could be an opportunity for Japan, but could you summarize what negative impact it could cause for the Japanese economy? Thank you.
Right, so I think the negative impact will be, one thing will be what the U.S. does from a currency perspective. I mean, right now, we've had in the interim term since he's been elected, the dollar strengthened substantially against the yen and other currencies, on the idea that there's going to be a stronger, among other things, there's going to be a stronger economy under Trump and so forth. But the way that actually will manifest is is not necessarily in getting a budget from Congress to build infrastructure, do the things he's promised he's going to do. It's much more likely he's going to increase the debt burden in the United States, which means from the standpoint of Japan, China, and so forth, there's going to be a request or a continued impetus towards buying our debt. And I think ultimately that will mean the dollar will go down. And I think the yen will sort of go back to it's the appreciation state that it's been in, which has trade repercussions. Again, that's not happening right now. I think that will be sort of the second phase of what happens, because also what's happening now is that there's been an expectation that the Fed's going to raise rates by a little bit this year. They haven't raised rates since last December. That was a disaster for markets. That's basically what ultimately caused, among other things, negative rates in Europe, negative rates here. But I think even if it does raise rates and that does continue this mini standpoint of strengthening the dollar, ultimately it's going to crash markets. There's still financial instability throughout the banking system, and ultimately that's going to do what it did the last time there was a financial crisis, and whenever there is financial instability, which is to increase the value of the yen in those periods. So I think there's going to be sort of an up and down period through that, and that's going to impact Japan and the sort of import-export relationship with the United States in a sort of volatile fashion as that comes into play.
Okay, I have a question, and I'll open the questioning to everyone in the room. There's two things that you hear a lot about a Trump presidency, and I think you mentioned it here, is that we're going into uncharted territory. Now, we have in the United States the famed checks and balances in the institutions, but again, you've just pointed out how the president has the authority to appoint many very powerful individuals in the government. Do you think these two are going to collide somewhat, or do you think that the checks and balances are sufficient to meet this possible challenge?
I mean, the structure of checks and balances continues, but I do think we are in a period, again, and this is kind of a new historic period, yet even more unprecedented because we have someone from outside of Washington now running the White House, is that you do have an alignment of not just Republicans. It's not even just the idea that it's one party that's in power, because the idea of checks and balances were that you have a legislative body that could vote for or vote against or create legislation for or against what the president's agenda was, and then you had a judicial system that could basically either try things or come into play when it was necessary from a Supreme Court standpoint. And these were the factors that sort of balanced each other out. But if you have a situation where he's appointing the next a Supreme Court judge, and if another judge leaves and you continue to appoint another one and so forth, you have a very conservative balance in the Supreme Court. You have a balance of Republicans in the House and Senate that are also very conservative. They're not really old school Republicans. I want to say like Eisenhower Republicans. They're Republicans that were more about, sort of allowing for fiscal stimulus or allowing for budget expansion that would actually help the economy. So I think that's where there's actually going to be a check and balance against him, because I think that is something he wants to try to do, and that's what I mentioned before. I think it's going to go into debt instead of into an extra added budget line in Congress. But we're in a new period. We're in an old new period. We're in a new period again because he's a billionaire business person with no public office experience coming into that role, but we're also in a new period because you will have every single body all within the same political party. What that does give, though, is the check and balance to the outside political party, because whether or not they regain power of any of the House or more likely the Senate, say in the next election, there is an ability to take a look at what happened in this election and where the electorate was in terms of how polarized they were and what the actual concerns are from people on the streets and people throughout the country, and actually come up with sort of policies that will go against what might be coming out of Congress during this next period until the next election period for the Senate. So the check and balance, I think, is going to come from the outside more than it's going to come from the inside, if anything, during this period.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Gregory Clark, freelance. Mr. Trump has said that he'll emphasize infrastructure spending and he'll cut taxes. And it's obviously a good move. People want to do that in Japan and Europe too, I suppose. But they run into the problem of government debt. Now, there's a school of economic thinking which exists in Japan and in Europe, and that says that provided there's no risk of inflation, governments can issue as much money as they like. You know about it, you know the people involved. It's quite there's a group here in Japan. I was wondering, is there any thinking along these lines in the United States, and who are the people? I think Lawrence Summers is involved to some extent. Do you know who is in, if it exists?
Well, you're talking about sort of classic Keynesian kind of economic.
It's separate from Keynesian, really. The governments are able to issue.
As long as we have basically cheap
governments
money.
have the right to issue money anyway. Central banks can't stop them, but they can require central banks to issue whatever money is needed for the spending, provided there is no risk of inflation.
Right. It's interesting because the U.S. has had basically no inflation, or to low inflation during this entire period, and there was a lot of debate about how if you do keep money in the system, it's so cheap that at some place that's going to create inflation. The reality is there is inflation in some areas in the United States, which are in the cost of people's lifestyles, whether that is the cost of education, whether that's the cost of healthcare, whether that's the cost of sort of basic necessities, heating, gas, etc. There's been a lot of inflation in day-to-day life that doesn't get captured in the general inflation of the country. So that's kind of been a way that the Federal Reserve can say, well, as long as we keep an eye on inflation and it's low, we can keep money at zero. It is one of the reasons the debt has been able to increase as much as it has, because you're not paying basically. We're not paying a lot of interest to other countries for lending us money for our debt, and neither is any other country. I mean, the most recent move by the Bank of Japan to have the 10-year be zero, basically at a very flat yield curve, was the idea that you could borrow money in the future, you could build, there isn't strong inflation, and it doesn't cost a lot to pay back as long as you keep rates low, which is why, again, I think we're in this sort of global period of low rates regardless of inflation. That's different from the U.S. And Trump wanting an infrastructure budget to do that. It's one thing to pen a requirement for a budget and have it pass through Congress and say, okay, well, we want to raise X billion dollars for bridges in the middle of the country. We want to, no bridges, whatever. We want to create highways. We want to restructure bridges. We want to, have better highways. I said highways, but whatever it might be, he has to still create a budget, and it still has to pass. And that's different from the sort of more philosophical idea of Larry Summers saying, well, we can do this because the cost of money is effectively zero. I think those two things in the United States are different than they are in Europe or they are in Japan, because here you don't have quite the same pushback that I think will happen in Congress for expanding the budget for infrastructure. Again, expanding it for defense, fine. Expanding it for infrastructure, I think, is going to be more problematic in the United States from a budget perspective, which means it has to be debt, which is why rates have to stay low. And inflation, well, I think, will continue to stay low because it just has. So unlike Europe and Japan, where, again, you don't have the internal disputes over budget, you just have the basic allocations as long as inflation is low and the cost of debt is cheap to build infrastructure. So I think in the U.S. it's going to be more tricky in terms of whether we actually do that or whether Trump has just said he's going to do that.
You would need a follow-up, Greg? Yeah.
I'm not sure if you realize there's been enormous pressure, political pressure, it's not necessarily in the diet, on the government to cut spending on infrastructure, to cut national debt. And this is one of the reasons why the Japanese economy has been in such a bad state. Now, as I say, there are people getting around this in Japan and elsewhere by saying that what I said
Right,
before,
right.
that provided there's no risk of inflation, you can spend as much money as you like. I
Right.
just wondered who in the United States is joined. In England, you have Adair Turner, right?
Right.
Here you have a small group, I won't mention them. I was wondering in the United States if that thinking was becoming prevalent.
Right, and I guess I would say that I would say I'm not sure whether it's prevalent. I mean, we've had people, for example, like Paul Krugman, who was on the progressive, basically on the sort of Hillary Clinton side, let's say the Democratic side of the equation, who has talked about the idea of, as long as inflation is low, that we can continue to basically build from the standpoint of the government, build infrastructure and so forth. Is the exact same thing that you've been talking about, or that you mentioned. And there has been, the difference in the states is that there's, again, you have not just pressure, but you have the ability to vote or not vote on that from the standpoint of Congress, and whether we actually build infrastructure, which we have not done, despite that theory. I'm saying it's unlikely that's going to happen just because Trump said it would. With respect to here, with respect to the world, but Europe and Japan, certainly there's been a massive increase in debt, and the idea has been that debt can be used for infrastructure. I think, as in the United States, a lot of the debt's been used to subsidize the financial system and subsidize things other than the real economy and infrastructure. So the extent that that's happening here, it's not a useful diversion of that debt. Excuse me.
Have a drink.
But it's also been the path along which every nation has gone in this post-crisis coordinated cheap money period.
Yes, sir.
Thomas Sullivan, Associate Member, Nomi. On this subject of the losses on bond portfolios last week, I think it was about $1 trillion. I was just wondering if I could get your perspective on how damaging that has been for pension funds. And of course, we shouldn't forget that Mr. Trump has filed bankruptcy 5 times. And, from an investor perspective, would you not expect to Greg's point, get a higher return on the debt that he's going to issue? And also, if I could just quickly ask you your opinions on popular vote versus electoral college vote. Clinton won by 2 million votes. I'm just wondering if you, in your capacity as an advisor to Bernie Sanders, could you give us your personal view on that?
Sure. Just on that first, yes, we have an electorate and a popular vote, and it's not one-to-one. It's based on how many votes are given particular areas, particular states, and most states are winner take all. And so even though Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote in terms of the actual physical number of people who voted, the way that they broke down across the country was such that the Electoral College gave Trump the victory. What that means is that in practice, it's a very low mandate. I mean, it's not like, it means that more than half of the actual people in the country didn't vote for Trump. And as a result, I think that's given impetus to, 2 reasons for impetus to the movements that have been developing in terms of protest movements against Trump. One is that this idea that people didn't vote for him, and that there's a lot of talk now, and there has been for some time, to abolish the Electoral College in general. It's been around since the times of sort of slavery. It's been used for different things, and it's something that actually Obama could have not abolished, but tried to change some of the state and some of the regional lines on in terms of the number of electorates, but that didn't happen. But it has given impetus to the protest movement, just the sheer numbers of people who didn't vote for him. But also, it's I think that movement's gonna continue. I mean, I think that there's going to be a pretty strong protest vote going into the inauguration, and I think, just going back to that point of the checks and balances, I think that's where hopefully a lot of discussion will take place in terms of what everybody wants for the country in general. In terms of your other question, sorry, go back just. Right. So it's 2 things on the pension funds. Sorry. It's called affecting my. Anyway, so on the pension funds, there's a couple of things that are problematic throughout the world. and the U.S., which relate to not just the losses on a particular week or because of bond markets going up, the yields going up and bond prices going down. It's also because the fact that there's been zero interest rates for so long, and there's been growing ages in populations in terms of extending how many people are retiring and require their pension funds going into Europe, in the US, and so forth. Getting 0% on what's in there is not keeping it's not keeping track with even low inflation, and it means that the payouts for pension funds or for insurance on pension funds are quite low relative to history. So it means that there's, again, a sort of instability and this lack of balance between the liabilities and where investments can come for pension funds. And what that means is if pension funds have to meet their requirements, they have to, unless rates go up, they have to invest in more risky assets. And one of the things that's been happening in the U.S. and into this, what happened under Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, was that there was a lot of discussion about having more pension funds and retirement funds be allowed to invest in more risky assets in general in order to pay out pensioners. Now, if rates are going to go up and the value of bonds are going to go down, or we're going to have market crashes because rates go up very quickly or in a surprise fashion, that would be another reason they would lose money. So they would be basically caught twice. They would have missed interest rate payments on 8 years effectively going into their pensions, and this is a big problem in Europe as well. And I'm less clear on whether it's the same kind of issue here because there's less investment or desire for investment in riskier securities. But it's been an issue in the U.S. It is an issue in Europe. They've lost money on that. And if the markets then all of a sudden go down because rates go up or because there's more instability coming from a financial system that hasn't been corrected from rates moving or the interactions on a global basis of that happening, it hurts pensioners twice. And it also hurts insurers of pensioners as well, which is kind of a subcategory. It's sort of like the AIG or the subprime insurers of pension funds also get hurt. So it creates another impetus for pain for people who are getting older, as well as just the financial system in general. So it's kind of bad on both sides, staying like it is now or rates going up.
Can you take one more question? We're just about out of time. Yes? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Marina Yoshimura, and I'm a student member at the FCCJ. So you mentioned that Japan could lead its own TPP or some sort of trade with other alliances. And about that, how do you think the United States would perceive this leadership, and by extension, how would the international community perceive this leadership? In other words, would they consider this leadership to be aggressive and sneaky, or reasonable and effective? Thank you.
That's a really good question. I guess it depends how it's executed. But it's like this: if there's a trade agreement that's been constructed over time, and it has every country in it besides the U.S., and the U.S. refuses to be a part of it, then it's not necessarily sneaky to say, all right, well, we're just going to do this without you for now, and you are welcome. Later on we can renegotiate. We can renegotiate some of the principles of the agreement. It's not like any agreement's a perfect agreement for any individual economy or the people in that economy. And that was one of the things against the TPP from the United States. But I don't think it's sneaky to say, well, we worked on an agreement. We can certainly tinker around the edges of it. You're in or you're out. And then go back and say, well, or a very open way to do it would be to say, why don't we, you have to restructure some of the language and, talking and stuff back and forth. But why don't we do this for now, and we'll renegotiate in a year from now, and, if you want to join, you can. But then you're joining a stronger alliance of trade. So basically everybody wins out of that.
Okay, we have run out of time, I'm afraid. So my last task today is to provide you with a 1-year honorary membership of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. So that's for you, and if we can just have a thank you again for our speaker today.
Thank you, everybody.